Lila Grayson stood behind the counter of the Circle K, her elbows propped on the chipped formica, staring at the rain-slicked window where the neon open sign buzzed like a tired cicada. It was 2:17 a.m., and the small town of Milford slept under a shroud of drizzle, the kind that didn't so much fall as hang in the air, dampening everything with a stubborn, clinging gray. The gas station smelled of stale coffee and motor oil, a scent so baked into her life she barely noticed it anymore. She adjusted her name tag, its edges curling from years of fidgeting, and sighed, a soft, private sound swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator case. 23, a college dropout with a backpack full of half-finished dreams, she'd washed up here, tethered to night shifts because they asked less of her than daylight did. Outside, the sodium lights cast trembling pools of orange on the wet pavement, and the occasional truck roared past on the country road that ribboned through town, its tires hissing like a whispered secret. Lila liked the quiet, the predictability, restocking the candy aisle, wiping down the lottery machine, counting the till with the precision of a monk at prayer. It was a life small enough to hold in her hands, even if it left her fingers cold. She'd once wanted more, art school, a studio with paint-splattered floors, but that was before anxiety had clawed its way into her chest, before she'd fled campus with her sketchbooks and a stammered apology. Now, Milford was her world, and the gas station its dim-lit heart. Tonight felt heavier, though. The rain tapped insistently on the roof, a rhythm that matched the ache in her temples, and the clock above the door seemed stuck, its second hand twitching like a trapped fly. She was reaching for the mop, its handle worn smooth by her grip, when a sharp, scrabbling noise cut through the stillness. Not the usual clatter of a raccoon at the dumpster, but something frantic, desperate. Lila froze, her breath catching as she peered through the window. Nothing but shadows and the glint of rain. Then it came again, a high-pitched squeak, almost a cry, from the alley behind the store. Her heart thudded, a traitor to her instinct to stay put. She grabbed the flashlight from under the counter, its beam weak and yellow, and hesitated at the back door. Probably just a cat, she muttered, her voice thin in the empty space. But curiosity, or maybe loneliness, nudged her forward. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of damp air that smelled of earth and rust, and she stepped into the alley, the gravel crunching under her sneakers. The beam swept over soggy cardboard and a tipped-over trash can before landing on a writhing shape near the chain-link fence. A small animal, tangled in a plastic bag, its limbs jerking in a panic that mirrored her own. Lila's stomach lurched. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the wet soaking through her jeans, and aimed the light closer. A ferret, its fur matted and streaked with mud, stared back at her with wide, glassy eyes, its tiny chest heaving. The bag had twisted around its neck, a cruel noose, and its paws scrabbled uselessly against the gravel. "Oh, God, hold on," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached out. The ferret flinched, baring sharp teeth, but she didn't pull back. She'd never touched anything wild before, not like this, yet her fingers moved with a strange, steady purpose, teasing the plastic free until it slipped away, leaving the creature gasping in her palms. It was lighter than she'd expected, a warm, quivering weight against her skin. She cradled it, her breath fogging in the chill, and felt its heartbeat, a rapid, fragile pulse that seemed to sync with hers. "You're okay," she said, more to herself than to it, her voice cracking. The ferret's eyes, dark and bright as ink, held hers for a moment before it squirmed, weak but alive. Lila stood, the rain dripping from her hood onto its whiskered face, and made a choice she didn't fully understand. She tucked it inside her jacket, its damp fur pressing against her chest, and hurried back into the store, the door banging shut behind her. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she set the ferret on the counter, its claws clicking faintly against the surface. It shook itself, spraying droplets, and Lila laughed, a rusty, startled sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. She grabbed a handful of paper towels, blotting its fur, and noticed the black mask around its eyes, like a bandit from an old cartoon. "Bandit," she said aloud, testing the name, and the ferret tilted its head as if it approved. For the first time in years, the gas station felt less like a cage and more like a threshold, though to what, she couldn't yet say. The gas station's back room was a cramped cave of cardboard boxes and flickering fluorescent tubes, but it was warm, and that was enough for Lila as she knelt on the linoleum, Bandit nosing at the edges of a makeshift nest she'd fashioned from a towel and an empty nacho chip box. The rain had softened to a murmur outside, a distant percussion against the night's stillness, and the clock on the wall ticked toward 3 a.m. Her shift wouldn't end for another 4 hours, but time felt slippery now, bent around this small, scruffy creature who'd tumbled into her life. She watched Bandit sniff the air, his whiskers twitching, and felt a pang, half fear, half wonder, at the responsibility she'd unwittingly claimed. "What am I doing?" she muttered, her voice low, as if the ferret might judge her. She'd never had a pet, not even a goldfish. Her childhood had been a blur of rented trailers and her mother's cigarette smoke, no room for anything that needed tending. Yet here she was, tearing open a packet of beef jerky from the store shelf, expiration date be damned, and offering a shred to Bandit. He snatched it with delicate paws, nibbling with a ferocity that made her smile despite the knot in her chest. His fur was still damp, clumped into spikes, and she reached out hesitantly, brushing her fingertips along his back. He didn't flinch this time, just kept eating, and the warmth of his body under her hand sent a shiver through her, unfamiliar and electric. Lila sat back on her heels, the floor cold through her jeans, and let her thoughts drift. She should call someone, animal control, maybe, but the idea soured in her mind. They'd take him away, lock him in a cage, or worse. She pictured his bright eyes dimming behind bars and shook her head. "Not happening," she said firmly, startling herself with the resolve in her voice. Bandit looked up, a scrap of jerky dangling from his mouth, and she laughed again, softer this time, a sound that felt like stretching a muscle long unused. The rest of her shift blurred past in a haze of small acts, refilling the coffee machine, sweeping the floor, all while stealing glances at Bandit as he explored the back room, darting behind boxes and dragging a stray receipt in his teeth. By the time dawn smudged the sky with gray and pink, Lila's jacket was zipped around him again, his head poking out like a curious passenger as she locked up and trudged the half-mile to her apartment. The air smelled of wet grass and gasoline, and her sneakers squelched on the cracked sidewalk, but she barely noticed. Her mind was on Bandit, his weight against her chest a quiet anchor in the morning's chill. Her apartment was a one-room box above the hardware store, its walls stained with the ghosts of old water leaks and its single window rattling in the frame. She set Bandit on the floor, and he skittered off, sniffing at the frayed rug and the legs of her thrift store futon. Lila kicked off her shoes, exhaustion tugging at her bones, but she couldn't rest yet. She rummaged through her tiny kitchen, a hot plate, a dented saucepan, until she found a can of tuna. The lid popped with a hiss, and Bandit appeared at her feet, chittering excitedly, his tail a blur. She spooned some onto a saucer, and he dove in, his little grunts of satisfaction tugging at something deep in her, a thread she hadn't known was there. She sank onto the futon, watching him eat, and let her head tip back against the wall. The ceiling was speckled with mildew, a map of neglect, and she traced it with her eyes as her thoughts wandered. She'd saved him, hadn't she? That frantic moment in the alley, it had been her hands, her choice. The realization settled over her like a warm blanket, frayed but comforting. But then came the doubt, sharp as a splinter, what now? She couldn't keep a ferret in this dump. She barely kept herself here, with her $9 an hour job and a bank account that mocked her every time she checked it. Bandit finished his meal and clambered onto the futon, curling into a ball against her thigh. His fur was drier now, soft under her tentative touch, and his breathing slowed into a rhythm that lulled her racing mind. "You're a mess," she whispered, half to him, half to herself, and felt a smile tug at her lips. She didn't have answers, about him, about her, but for the first time in years, the silence of her apartment didn't feel like a weight pressing down. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. As the morning light crept through the blinds, striping the floor in gold, Lila closed her eyes, Bandit's warmth seeping into her side. She didn't know what she was doing, not really, but she knew she wasn't letting go. Not yet. And in that fragile, unspoken promise, something long buried, a flicker of purpose, a spark of care, began to stir, faint but alive. The next few days unfurled like a dream Lila hadn't known she could still have, a quiet rhythm stitched together by Bandit's presence. Her apartment, once a tomb of chipped paint and sagging furniture, became a stage for his antics. He'd dart beneath the futon, only to emerge with a sock she'd lost months ago, dragging it triumphantly across the floorboards that creaked under his tiny weight. Or he'd leap onto the windowsill, his claws clicking against the glass, chittering at the sparrows that flitted in the bare maple outside. Lila watched, mesmerized, a mug of instant coffee cooling in her hands, the steam curling into the air like a question she couldn't quite ask. She'd taken to talking to him, her voice filling the empty spaces she'd grown used to ignoring. "You're a thief, you know that," she'd say as he stashed a pen cap under her pillow, his masked face peering up at her with impish glee. He didn't answer, of course, but his tilted head and twitching whiskers felt like a reply, and that was enough. The sound of her own laughter startled her at first, bright, unguarded, echoing off the walls, but it grew familiar, a melody she hadn't played since her sketchbooks gathered dust in a box under the bed. Nights at the gas station shifted too. She smuggled Bandit in her backpack, his wriggling warmth a secret against her spine as she clocked in. Between the rare customers, a trucker buying smokes, a teenager with a fistful of change for a soda, she'd let him loose in the back room, where he'd tunnel through a pile of empty chip bags or nap in the crook of her arm while she balanced the register. The fluorescent hum overhead seemed softer, the rain tapping the roof less lonely. She'd catch herself smiling at nothing, a private bloom of joy, and wonder who this version of herself was, creeping out from the shadows. But it wasn't all ease. Anxiety still gnawed at her, a familiar beast with sharp teeth. What if he got sick? What if someone found out she was keeping him? She didn't know the first thing about ferrets. Did they need shots, special food? She'd spent her last $12 on a bag of cat kibble and a cheap fleece blanket from the dollar store, cutting it into strips for his nest. At night, lying on the futon with Bandit curled beside her, she'd stare at the ceiling and feel the old panic rise, her breath hitching. "I can't mess this up," she'd whisper into the dark, and his soft snores would steady her, a tether to something she couldn't name. One evening, restless and needing a distraction, she pulled her ancient laptop from under a pile of laundry. The screen flickered to life, and on impulse, she set her phone beside it, propping it up to record Bandit as he wrestled with a crumpled receipt. His antics were hypnotic, spinning, pouncing, tumbling over himself, and when he finally flopped onto his back, paws in the air, she couldn't help but giggle. She uploaded the clip to X, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing a caption, "Meet Bandit. He's a sock-stealing menace." It was a whim, a way to shake off the solitude that still clung to her like damp clothes, but she didn't expect much. Her account was a ghost town, a handful of followers from her art school days who'd long since moved on. The next morning, bleary-eyed from her shift, she checked her phone and froze. The video had exploded, hundreds of likes, retweets, comments piling up like leaves in a storm. "He's adorable. More Bandit, please." Strangers sent laughing emojis, ferret memes, tips about toys and treats. Lila's chest tightened, a mix of thrill and terror. She'd cracked open a window to her world, and people were peering in, not with judgment, but with delight. She filmed another clip that night, Bandit tunneling through a cardboard tube she'd scavenged from the store, and posted it, her hands shaking as she hit send. The response was immediate, a flood of warmth that spilled across the screen. Emboldened, she started talking in the videos, her voice hesitant at first, barely above a whisper. "He's, kind of a goof," she said, panning to Bandit as he batted at her shoelace. "Found him in the rain. Didn't think I'd keep him, but," she trailed off, and the comments poured in, "You're his hero. Love your vibe, keep going." One night, after a third coffee and a surge of reckless courage, she admitted more. "I don't get out much," she mumbled, scratching Bandit's ears. "Anxiety's a thing. But he makes it better." The vulnerability stung, but the replies, "Same here, you're not alone," wrapped around her like a quilt. Bandit, oblivious, nuzzled her hand, his fur sleek now from her care, and Lila felt the thread of purpose tighten. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was reaching, however tentatively, towards something brighter. The world was small still, but it was growing, and Bandit, with his playful chaos, was leading her into it, one stolen sock at a time. The days began to blur into a strange, sweet cadence, each one stitched together by Bandit's boundless energy and the glowing screen of Lila's phone. Her apartment, once a mausoleum of faded hopes, hummed with life, his claws skittering across the floor, the ping of notifications, the rustle of paper as she scribbled notes for new video ideas. The air smelled of tuna and the sharp tang of marker ink, a scent that tugged at memories she'd buried deep. She'd started sketching again, tentative lines on scavenged receipts, Bandit mid-leap, Bandit curled in a ball, his masked face a muse she hadn't known she needed. The drawings were rough, her hands unsteady from disuse, but they felt alive, pulsing with a quiet joy she'd forgotten she could claim. Her followers, hundreds now, then 1,000, noticed. "You're an artist," they'd comment under her videos, where she'd sometimes flash a doodle before panning to Bandit's latest mischief. One morning, a package arrived at her door, wedged against the peeling paint, a small box of colored pencils and a note scrawled in loopy cursive. "For Bandit's human, keep drawing." Lila stared at it, her throat tight, the wood of the pencil smooth against her fingertips. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't dared to, but there it was, proof that her little world was spilling outward, touching others in ways she couldn't fathom. She posted a thank you video, her voice wobbling as she held up the gift, Bandit weaving between her ankles. "I used to draw a lot," she said, barely meeting the camera's eye. "Stopped when, well, life got messy. But maybe I'll try again." The response was a deluge, more packages trickled in, sketchpads, watercolor pens, even a tiny ferret harness someone swore Bandit would love. She laughed through tears as she opened them, Bandit nosing at the wrapping, and felt the weight of her old dreams shift, no longer a burden but a possibility. Nights at the gas station became a canvas too. She'd sketch behind the counter between customers, the scratch of pencil on paper a counterpoint to the rain's steady drip outside. Bandit slept in her backpack, a warm lump against her chair, and she'd pause to stroke his fur, her fingers tracing the curve of his spine. The drawings grew bolder, Bandit stealing a candy bar, Bandit peering from her hood, and she started selling them online, prints and stickers slapped together with her shaky tech skills. Orders ticked in, $5 here, $10 there, and her bank account, once a barren wasteland, sprouted green shoots of hope. But courage came in fits and starts. She'd wake some mornings with her chest tight, the familiar claws of doubt digging in. What if this fell apart? What if she wasn't good enough? She'd sit on the futon, Bandit sprawled across her lap, and stare at the growing pile of art supplies, her breath shallow. "I don't know how to do this," she'd whisper, and he'd nudge her hand, insistent, until she picked up a pencil again. He didn't care about her fears, only her presence, and that stubborn trust pulled her forward, one small stroke at a time. Then came the email that stopped her cold. She'd been wiping down the gas station counter, Bandit nibbling a treat in the back, when her phone chimed. Subject, gallery opportunity. A local art co-op in Milford, barely a mile from her apartment, had seen her posts. "We'd love to feature your work," it read. A small exhibit. Ferret themed, of course. Lila's hand shook as she reread it, the words blurring. An exhibit. Her art, on walls, for people to see. The thought thrilled her and terrified her in equal measure, a collision of longing and dread that left her dizzy. She didn't reply right away. For 3 days, she carried the email like a stone in her pocket, turning it over in her mind. She'd film Bandit, now sleek and glossy, prancing in his new harness, but her voice was quieter, her smiles tighter. "What if they hate it?" she asked him one night, sprawled on the rug as he burrowed into a pile of laundry. He popped out, a sock draped over his head, and she snorted, the tension cracking. "You're ridiculous," she said, scooping him up, his warmth seeping into her palms. "Fine. We'll do it." She typed a reply at 2 a.m., Bandit asleep on her chest, the laptop's glow casting shadows on the walls. "I'd be honored. Thank you." Her finger hovered over send, her pulse loud in her ears, and then she clicked, a tiny act of bravery that felt monumental. The next morning, she started sketching in earnest, portraits of Bandit, yes, but also herself, tentative and unguarded, a girl and her ferret against the world. The lines flowed easier now, her hand remembering what her heart had tried to forget. By the time the exhibit date loomed, Lila had a stack of drawings ready, framed in cheap thrift store finds. She stood in her apartment, Bandit at her feet, and looked at the pile, her life, her mess, her quiet triumph. "We're really doing this," she said, and he chittered, as if he'd known all along. The gallery opening crept up on Lila like a dawn she hadn't expected to see, soft and inevitable. It was a Friday evening, the air crisp with the bite of early spring, and Milford's tiny art co-op buzzed with a warmth that spilled onto the sidewalk. The building was an old brick storefront, its windows streaked with condensation, and inside, fairy lights draped the walls, casting a golden glow over the mismatched chairs and the hum of voices. Lila stood near the back, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater, a thrift store find she'd ironed twice, while Bandit perched on her shoulder, his harness clipped tight, his nose twitching at the scent of cheese cubes and cheap wine. Her drawings hung in a neat row, each frame a window into the life she'd stitched together with Bandit. There was the ferret stealing a sock, his eyes glinting with mischief. There was Lila's hand cradling him in the rain, smudged graphite capturing the tremble of that first touch, and there, in the corner, a self-portrait, her face half hidden by her hood, Bandit peeking out, a quiet smile breaking through her usual guarded lines. She'd hesitated over that one, but the co-op manager, a wiry woman named Claire with a laugh like a wind chime, had insisted. "It's you," Claire had said, pinning it up. "People need to see the heart of it." Now, people milled around her work, strangers, neighbors, even a few gas station regulars who nodded at her with shy recognition. She heard murmurs, "Cute, so real, look at that detail," and felt her cheeks burn, a mix of pride and panic. Bandit squirmed, and she scratched his ears, his fur a lifeline against the crowd. "Be good," she whispered, though he was the star, drawing coups and outstretched hands. Someone snapped a photo, and she flinched, then softened as a girl with pink hair grinned and said, "He's famous." The night blurred into moments, a man in a plaid jacket buying her sock thief sketch, the cash crisp in her palm, Claire pressing a plastic cup of wine into her hand, winking as she toasted to new beginnings, a kid tugging her sleeve to ask if Bandit could dance. Lila stammered through answers, her voice finding its footing, and when a woman with gray curls told her, "You've got a gift, hon," she ducked her head but didn't disagree. For once, the doubt didn't claw back, it sat quiet, tamed by the warmth around her. She slipped outside midway through, needing air, and leaned against the brick wall, Bandit nestled in her arms. The street was still, the sky a deep indigo pricked with stars, and the muffled laughter from inside felt like a hug she could finally accept. She thought of the alley, the rain, the plastic bag, how small that moment had been, how vast it had grown. "You did this," she murmured to Bandit, his eyes glinting in the streetlight. He yawned, unimpressed, and she chuckled, the sound carrying on the breeze. Back inside, the crowd thinned as the night waned, but a handful lingered, fans from her videos, their faces familiar from profile pics. They thanked her, shared stories of their own pets, their own struggles, and Lila listened, really listened, her usual walls crumbling. One handed her a ferret-shaped keychain, another a sketch of Bandit they'd drawn. "You've got a community now," a guy with a beard said, and she nodded, her throat too full to speak. When the last guest left, Claire locked up, leaving Lila alone with her art and the faint hum of the space heater. She sank into a chair, Bandit curling in her lap, and traced the edges of this new normal. The gas station awaited her tomorrow, but it wasn't a trap anymore, it was a step, a means to more nights like this. She'd sell more drawings, save for a better place, maybe even take Bandit on a trip somewhere green and wide. The future wasn't a void now, it was a canvas, waiting for her mark. She stood, hoisting Bandit to her shoulder, and took one last look at the gallery, her quiet triumph, earned in pencil strokes and ferret kisses. The walk home was cold, her breath fogging, but his warmth against her neck was enough. She hummed softly, a tune she didn't recognize, and felt the rhythm of her life shift, steady, hopeful, hers. And there it is, Lila and Bandit's story, a bittersweet dance from loneliness to light. I hope it left you with that gentle warmth, a reminder of how the smallest encounters can redraw our worlds. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe below so you don't miss the next one. I've got more stories brewing, and I'd love for you to come along.